Welcome to this Q&A video for May 2022. I invited Patreon supporters to put forward any questions they might have, and they responded with a wide-ranging field of topics as always. So let's dive straight in. This week is when the latest World Economic Forum is taking place in Davos, so that was on a few people's minds. With Davos back in the news this week, I realise I'm still struggling to achieve a balanced assessment of the WEF, especially given the breadth of hyperbolic commentary from our multipolar media. So are Klaus Schwab and his chums kindly technocrats developing solutions for the world's nation-states to improve the lives of their citizens? Or are they more akin to Darth Vader and his accomplices, waging a campaign to subdue the free peoples of the world under the yoke of empire? Can you help me out with a balanced assessment of the WEF's goals, strategies and results, plus the mechanisms they employ to exert influence across the globe? That last part is too broad for a Q&A question. That would be a deep dive video all of its own. But let's start with the framing of a question. In life, surely we know that the world isn't divided into wholly good people and wholly wicked people, so the answer to the question is always going to be neither one nor the other. Are Klaus Schwab and his chums kindly technocrats looking to improve the lives of citizens? Well, I think a significant number of them would see themselves that way. I mean, we're all the heroes of our own movie, remember? That doesn't mean that external observers who know them well would necessarily hold them to be the benevolent godlike figures that the parody description suggests. Or are they more akin to Darth Vader and his accomplices waging a campaign to subdue the free people of the world? Well, that version is less likely, simply because we've seen empire builders throughout history and they don't look or behave like that. If you sat Hitler, Stalin and Mao down with a blank piece of paper, described the modern era to them and tasked them with coming up with a plan to build a global empire, they would probably not come up with a think tank that's going to spend 50 years talking about stuff. Does that mean that they are right and virtuous? Well, look, there are think tanks on the political left, on the political right, on the technocratic side, on the nationalist side. They all pursue the ideas they believe in, many of which will be wrong, some of which will be right. None of them are angels, few of them are demons. We just notice the WEF because it has a generic enough mission that it's of interest to a wide spectrum of very well-connected people, and it has built on that strength extremely well and become very visible. The proposition is simply that first, businesses should give a damn about the state of society they're part of, because they don't exist in a separate ecosystem, and secondly, that businesses, governments and civil society will solve the big problems only if they work together. I've explained before why that holds appeal to different types of leaders, but as a proposition it is adaptable. It's as relevant a suggestion today as it was in 1971. The problems have changed, the people have changed, but except for Klaus Schwab himself, of course, but the idea that the movers and shakers of the world should get together to collaborate, that is never going to feel as though it's a bad thing to do, per se. As I've explained before, there are all sorts of reasons why self-centered people would be attracted to such networks, because of the power of the network, not necessarily because they're bought into the mission. I mean, Vladimir Putin went to the WEF, Nelson Mandela went to the WEF, Donald Trump went to the WEF. Whatever you think about any or all of those individuals, you probably recognise they had different agendas in why they went. As always, I would just argue that you look at what they're actually saying and doing, avoid the cartoon clown world version of heroes or villains. All of their main sessions are being live streamed and recorded. Have you watched any? I can tell you they are mostly worthy but dull. Some of them talk sense, some of them talk nonsense, and we believe in free speech, so people debating ideas isn't something I find especially terrifying. But what about the specific content? Well, let's bring in this related, relevant question. Although generally sceptical of the claims from some quarters that the World Economic Forum is part of a global conspiracy to bring about a communist world government, I did come across this. World Economic Forum launches Global Parity Alliance to accelerate diversity, equity and inclusion outcomes. Reading both the press release and the linked DEI page on the WEF website, it is all very woke. The WEF would be a tempting target for institutional capture, but their modus operandi should make them resistant to that. What do you think? A great specific question. So I looked at the Global Parity Alliance page, and I am not 100% sure about its place on the woke spectrum. It uses some of the modern language, but none of the real red flags about intersectionality and the logic of how that works. It reflects on the fact that diversity and inclusion is the soft underbelly of the corporate world when it comes to this stuff. 30 years ago, businesses had a genuine diversity problem, in common sense terms, that they recognised they needed to address. I remember a couple of decades ago doing a corporate responsibility review for one company that employed about 3,000 people in an area that had a high ethnic minority population, and it turned out they employed just around 30 of those ethnic minorities in their entire company. Now, it's not general wokeness to say that that's an indicator of some disconnect between them and their community. And this was at a time in the UK when people were talking a lot about institutional racism. So businesses have been genuinely trying to address this problem over decades and have generally found, for reasons we could go into, it's a much harder problem to solve than you would imagine. But that has made them very susceptible to the politically woke version of this issue, where rather than diversity, where you treat people as individuals, towards treating people as expressions of their group identity. The guilt-tripping language of woke racism is something that most of the rather clueless executives have been very much cowed by, which of course is the intent. And particularly with the colleges turning out now some aggressively woke young employees who are wreaking havoc in some of the workplaces. So corporations need to be seen to be taking the issue seriously. I mean, you can't and shouldn't want to totally ignore this issue, so steering it into the place where you could actually do some benefits seems to be the way to go. But I can also see the other side, the potential for institutional capture, where you simply let the wokeism dictate what you do because you're so scared of being called nasty names. And we can name some of the companies that have fallen into that trap. I don't look at that specific World Economic Forum initiative and get enough information from that to tell me what is its purpose and intent going to be within that spectrum. Quite possibly it's a live behind-the-scenes debate that will only emerge over time. People make the mistake of thinking that if there's an initiative like this, then there are people behind it who are all united in their perspective, all with a very clear agenda to proselytise for whatever that perspective might be. That happens a lot less than you would think, especially for global initiatives, where you get quite a lot of diversity of opinion. So I'm trying to paint the shades of grey. No doubt there'll be some people in the comments saying, "So, you're a big fan of Klaus Schwab, are you?" Which is sort of what I got after the last video in relation to the World Health Organization, even though I made no comments pro or anti the World Health Organization. Such is life. Accepting a likely minor warming of average global temperatures, why are the reported anticipated effects negative? If the world was facing a drop in temperature as considered likely a generation ago, would that mean all the effects would be positive? If not, does that mean we are lucky enough to be living in a Goldilocks climate where any deviation brings only negative results? No. So, two things on this question. One, beware of using words like minor, which are values-laden words. The difference in global average terms between today and the last glaciation is just 5 degrees. A minor difference in the global average temperature represents a huge amount of energy that has made its way into one part or another of the global climate system. Now, that doesn't mean it must necessarily represent catastrophe or any of those things, just that you shouldn't swallow the line that a minor difference means insignificant. Secondly, are we living in a Goldilocks climate where any deviation brings only negative results? Well, no and yes. It's a question of degrees. It's absolutely right, and one of those frustrations of this discussion, that because everything is a campaign communication these days, people will ignore or downplay the short-term positives. It is absolutely right that in the short term, the benefits of warmer temperatures in terms of reduced deaths from cold periods are more significant than the additional deaths from hot periods. That is both true, but also not an indicator of how this plays out with additional warming. By all measures, we expect that the benefits will give diminishing returns with further warming, while the negatives from hot periods will give accelerating harms. That's not because we luckily hit upon a Goldilocks level. Over geological timeframes, life adapts to fit the circumstances, so long as they're not so hostile that life can't endure at all. It becomes a Goldilocks zone because life adapts to it, not by chance. But the changes we're creating are not happening on a geological timescale, and rapid change is something that historically has seen major consequences for life. Now, a major coldwood shift would almost certainly have worse consequences more quickly, but we have to face the problems we have, not the problems we don't have. And the point is that having grown to huge numbers on the planet, fed by major, highly productive breadbasket agricultural regions, we have reached a point where we are more vulnerable even to the sort of natural variation that we have seen in the past. And that was why in the 1970s the world decided to put some real resource into researching the impact on climate, recognizing its vulnerability. Originally, it was because we would benefit from an early warning system in the face of natural variation, so that food production systems would be more prepared. Only in the process of doing that did we then realize that actually we had a different problem. What's shorter term than environmentalist? We need a snappy short term. Movement fails is no easy way to self-identify and recognize fellow members. I've been involved in a number of movements where people have spent long periods of time angsting over labels and definitions. And it's about two things. One is about framing a common group identity, which is what you're describing here. The other is about trying to find a commonly understood and compelling word or phrase that will intuitively explain a complex idea to people, which usually can't be done. Which is why for decades people have been whining about seeking alternatives to words like sustainability while never finding anything that actually stuck. But let's talk about the identity one. Theoretically, someone should be able to frame a group identity around people who follow the sort of perspective and approach that I promote on this channel. I haven't done that, but if I did, I would be focused on the approach, not on labels like environmentalist. Because those labels become defined around a particular set of solutions, not an open approach to evidence. Modern day environmentalists are, for instance, against nuclear power, mostly. There are exceptions, but mostly they are. Why? Largely because they have historically been against it. And even though the language now is that there's a climate emergency, their term, and this means that we should reevaluate everything, they don't want to reevaluate the things that make up the tenets of faith of their own identity. Anti-environmentalists will nod at that, but the same dynamic almost certainly applies to their group as well. It's standard group dynamics, and they're the ones in the comment sections jumping on my case because I didn't condemn someone in the way that they would approve. I'm not a fan of group identities that warp the way you see the world, so I would aspire rather to think based on the process of using reason, seeking to correct natural human biases. And the truth is, while there are communities that have come up with labels for that, they are remarkably unpowerful labels because the process cuts across what makes group identity so compelling. Does that make sense? Did in my head, anyway. Okay, change of topic coming up. In 2015, the European migrant crisis started after Italy and then the EU more broadly guaranteed safe passage for migrants crossing the Mediterranean. The rate of death decreased, but the number of migrants increased by a greater proportion, leading to a higher death toll. Does the act of safety create a moral hazard, paradoxically leading to more deaths? Is it ever acceptable to offer less support to cause fewer people to die? This is the classic tension between systems that offer incentives that on balance achieve outcomes versus people going directly to try to achieve those outcomes, running the risk of creating perverse incentives. Public policy is always going to be a fraught negotiation between the two. Because yes, if illegal immigration is difficult and dangerous, then fewer people will attempt it, and that may well mean that fewer people die as a result. But the ones who do attempt it will most likely be the most desperate and also the most deserving of help. So naturally, one wants to rescue them from the consequences. And that then opens the door for the opportunistic and all the others to follow, which is not a negative value judgment of opportunism, by the way, and all sorts of consequences then follow. You can complicate that by looking to the causes of the difficulties they may be facing at home, and various ways that those difficulties may be traced back to you. So our historical empires may well have benefited some of the countries that became part of them. They certainly screwed up a number of the others. Does that give us heightened responsibilities to help out? How long does that last before it expires? You shouldn't expect these questions to be easy. They go to the heart of the historical argument, for instance, between the right and the left. Systems that largely work to the maximum benefit by allowing people to pursue their own selfish best interest, which can be harsh to some that fail and may well appear callous, versus systems that try to benefit everyone but do so in ways that are less effective, as systems so often fail to achieve what they aim to do and selfish people subvert them for their own cause anyway. Now look, I'm aware that's only scratching the surface. Again, it's too big a topic to do justice to in a Q&A answer. Pandemic and vaccination are yesterday's news, I know. Have you come across the work of Professor Christine Stable-Benn? And what do you make of it? And why doesn't it receive any attention? The person asking the question then gave a link to a paper and an interview with Unheard. And the answer is no, I hadn't come across it. Quick bit of research that I'd done having gotten the question, and it seems to focus on one recent paper. So let's use this as a case study of approaches to claims that you see in the public space. So first of all, looking at the paper itself, first thing I notice is that it's a preprint with the Lancet, so not yet peer reviewed, but with an established and respected journal. And it asks whether there may be a significant difference between more traditional COVID vaccines, such as the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the mRNA vaccines, such as Pfizer, in terms of all-cause mortality. I note from the detail that it acknowledges that the sample sizes it's dealing with are very small, not directly comparable, and not targeted on the populations most at risk. So it gives interesting indications for further study rather than firm conclusions. Fine. At the point of reading that, I'm kind of imagining what people might be making of it, given the tendencies that are out there. The question referenced her work generally, so let's quickly check her other papers, and we can see that 4 others, they're all relatively quiet. 5 downloads, 8 downloads, 21 downloads, 35 downloads, and then this recent paper, 24,000 downloads. So we're really focusing just on this one particular paper, I'm guessing. So let's have a look at what people are saying about it. The Unheard article that's already been mentioned, for instance. And straight away we get to the conversion into journalese. Do the COVID vaccines save lives? A bombshell new study by a distinguished team of Danish researchers led by Professor Christine Stable-Benn suggests a surprisingly nuanced answer. Okay, so I get that if you see one source talking about a bombshell paper, then you may be wondering why it's not all over the media, and is it a conspiracy of silence, etc. But in this case, it seems to me that the bombshell description is hyperbolic compared to the relatively modest evidence base that it's drawing from, and that from a preprint paper. Indeed, and the article itself says, Stable-Benn is keen to stress that the sample is relatively small and is calling for further investigation, and also that the study took place during very low levels of COVID, so the relative advantage of protection against COVID would have been smaller at that time compared to at other points in the pandemic. Now, I'm not going to suggest I've carried out a detailed research process there, but it's sufficient to say that this is something to keep an eye on, follow the discussion as it evolves, keep an open mind. But yeah, ignore the hyperbole of those who would use uncompromising certainty about what's being said here, especially from those who have staked their public identity on a firm position pro or anti-vaccines, because they're burnishing their profile, not reflecting the truth of this particular piece of work. Okay, onto a sort of related theme. Shortly after the COVID-19 booster, my wife suffered with Bell's palsy, likely caused by a virus. On the internet rumour mill, they are reporting an increased number of Bell's palsy cases and attributing this to the vaccines. Question is there any evidence that this is the case, and are there any studies into the long-term effects of the vaccines? So first of all, sorry to hear about your wife's recent experience. I hope she recovered well and is free from any problems now, or rapidly on course to becoming so. And secondly, I give my usual caveat, nothing here I say constitutes medical advice of any sort. I am not remotely qualified to give such advice. And again, to answer the question robustly would be a full research job. I can only look at what's being said right now in the published literature, which was summarised in several papers over recent months, and the indicators seem currently to be that there exists a low but enhanced risk of Bell's palsy from the mRNA vaccines. This paper summarised that from 40,000 participants in the vaccine trials, there were 7 Bell's palsy cases compared with just 1 in the placebo arm of the trials. That suggests, but doesn't prove, that vaccination might be associated with Bell's palsy, albeit on a low-risk basis. Low risk? Not the same as no risk, of course. This situation is confused by media reports and the FDA briefings. The FDA briefing on the Pfizer trial was that observed frequency of reported Bell's palsy in the vaccine group is consistent with the expected background rate in the general population. That statement was removed from the briefing on a related Moderna trial, and the paper says this. However, this reporting is based on a misconception, driven by a subtle distinction between rates and proportions that has persisted in the lay media. The estimated incidence rate of Bell's palsy in the general population ranges from 15 to 30 cases per 100,000 person years. Since the 40,000 vaccine arm participants were followed for a median of 2 months, the combined safety population receiving vaccine across the 2 trials represents roughly 6,700 person years of observation time for an expected incidence of Bell's palsy of 1 to 2 cases, in line with the single observed case in the combined placebo arms. Therefore, the observed incidence of Bell's palsy in the vaccine arms is between 3.5 times and 7 times higher than would be expected in the general population. This finding signals a potential safety phenomenon and suggests inaccurate reporting of basic epidemiological context to the public. Ultimately, these things come down to a risk evaluation. The dangers of serious harm from COVID-19 are small but substantial. The dangers of harm from side effects from vaccine are significantly smaller but not zero. The vulnerabilities from either depend on other factors like your age, your weight, general health, and a few others. It becomes an evaluation that you have to make. From what I've seen on other papers detailing cases, such incidences were time limited. And I trust and hope that turned out to be the case for your wife. It seems like she may well have been one of the unlucky ones in that particular regard. You were saying our culture is turning out damaged people. Not sure I recall the specific context there, but no worries, let's carry on. Do you think it's largely because we have lost our natural and historic support systems? We used to live in and or near extended families, which admittedly could have some downsides, but still. And if so, what are we going to do about it then, since governments want us to move further away from traditional family and local support structures and want us ready to follow work, etc. There's no doubt that the breakdown of old social structures has had an impact, but let's be clear, it hasn't really been happening because governments wanted it to. It's more been happening because when given the choice, more and more of us are choosing for it to be so. I mean, yes, the old extended family meant that you would often end up living with granny or grandpa living with you 3 generations in one house, which has various benefits, but it also had a lot of downsides, and we're seeing that when they're given the choice, a lot of families prefer not to have that extended family set up. Now, is that good or bad? Yes. The loss of family integrity is a big deal, but at the same time, people could feel trapped in families that they didn't have much in common with, and that would feel like a life sentence with no remission. So I think the erosion of local community cohesion is probably the more serious challenge that maybe you could actually do something about with people motivated the way that they are. Extended families were a defence mechanism against a hostile world. You kept around you the only people who would reliably be on your side in the face of adversity. I don't think we're in that sort of position. We're transitioning from one social structure to an alternative, but as with any major change in norms, the new ways haven't been worked out. They haven't settled in. They're not stable or well-founded. Assuming we don't blow ourselves up in the meantime, I would expect we will gradually get better at these new ways of living that we're currently being drawn by preference towards. That might not be much comfort for today's discombobulated generations though, but we're going to have to make the best of what we've got in front of us. Hi Mallen. HSBC's Head of Responsible Business, Stuart Kirk, gave a presentation where he decried alarmist climate nonsense and got fired for it, or suspended, soon to be fired. Another grievous free speech violation, or did he deserve it? So this was the executive who gave a presentation to a Financial Times conference and clearly set out to create an impression by going against the mainstream. And if that was the aim, well, it was certainly successful. This isn't a pure free speech issue. He was speaking in his capacity as the head of department on behalf of his company. If his views were out of line with his company's perspective in his own area of specialism, then you would expect that to be an internal discussion first before it's spilling out into the public domain like that. If you're representing your company, then the company has a right to expect that you will represent its view, not your own. If they're divergent, then, well, that's why they pay you the big bucks. And if you can't take it on that basis, then don't work for them. Which is why I never went into the corporate space after leaving business in the community. It just doesn't suit the sort of mindset that I have. Now, should HSBC have suspended him? Well, it depends. There's always more background in these cases than is in the public domain. I mean, it could be that this represented the final straw in a pattern of behaviour. We don't know. So, for those that didn't see this, he didn't argue against the science of climate change. He just said that given the long timescales involved, his financial organisation shouldn't be factoring climate risk into its calculations. You could probably do that in a sparky way and survive, but he went out of his way to raise eyebrows, saying things like, "Who cares if Miami is 6 metres underwater in 100 years? Quite a lot of people, it turned out. He also threw in a lot of comments associated with those who often do argue with the science of climate change. Arguments like markets always go up, so we'll be rich enough to afford it, we'll be innovative enough to solve it, and that previous bad predictions have never come true. Generally bad arguments, straw men and the like that I have dealt with often here and won't repeat right now. What I'm more interested in are the arguments he made that I think do have merit, and which sank without trace because of all the rest of the nonsense that he wrapped them in. So he complained that companies are called upon to do too much climate reporting. Which is probably true. There's been a vast industry over a decade on indices and measures so that companies have to employ people to just measure and disclose data with questionable value. It didn't help his point by framing it as the amount of work those people make me do. But never mind. He said that financial firms were too focused on mitigating climate change and not enough on adaptation to the effects of climate change, which is arguably a fair point, certainly relevant to the whole discussion. He said there's too much emphasis on climate risk, on the balance of risks to the financial sector in the modern world. That may also well be true. What goes into a risk calculation should be focused on objective criteria around risk, not on current political fashion. Yes, early action on climate change is something society needs to do. That doesn't mean it has to be the thing that rises to the top of everyone's list every single day. There remain other material risks and issues of interest, so you could have built a conversation on those points. Instead, he kind of trolled his colleagues with a bunch of rather unnecessary provocative comments, and so the substantial discussion just got postponed yet again. Okay, this next question has been radically shortened. It is the last one. On an earlier video about COVID, you mentioned a country, Denmark I think, which had formed a consensus between the citizens, government, opposition and press in relation to its response to COVID, which overall proved to be generally successful on many fronts. Was this a singular example of a systemic difference between the English and Danish democratic systems in dealing with real issues? Assuming we should be able to learn from their approach, are we likely to? Nah, I very much doubt it. National identity and culture are not easily replicable in totally different national contexts. You have to make do with the reality that there are some areas where what they do works better, and then others where what we do works better. I mean, our country, the UK, is more innovative and was one of those that successfully nurtured rapid vaccine development and distribution. For instance, that's worth something. And there are times when a too ready and cosy societal consensus backfires on you because things that ought to be challenged don't get challenged. Look, wherever you are, it's always tempting to elevate the dissatisfactions you have with your own system and kind of idealise the benefits that you notice that others have with their systems. But as we saw with COVID, countries that were held up as shining examples early on often stumbled further down the line. Every system is flawed human beings trying their best to make the best job they can of the challenges that are in front of them. Which is a perfect description of me trying to answer all of your excellent questions. Thanks to my Patreon supporters who contributed questions. Apologies to those I didn't get to. Apologies to those who found the answers not quite hitting the mark. I did my best. I hope that at least you found some food for thought in all of that. Add your own comments below. See you on Friday for the news roundup. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.